The door did not slam. That was the cruelest part. It closed slow, with a soft and final click, the way people shut a door on something they have already decided to forget. A widow stood on the frozen step with a wool coat she had mended too many times, and she did not knock again. Behind her, the town slept warm. Lamplight, wood smoke, the low murmur of people who believed winter was still weeks away. She knew better. She had felt it that morning. The cold that comes too soon, the kind that bites the north side of a fence and leaves the south untouched. She had tried to tell them. She had stood in front of all of them and warned them. They called her a liar. Now the wind pulled at her coat like a hand, and somewhere out past the last fence line, the dark mountains waited. An old dog pressed against her leg. A dead man's notebook sat heavy in her pocket. She had nowhere to go but up, into the cold that everyone swore wasn't coming. And she was the only one in that whole valley who knew it would not stop. The cold came early that autumn. It did not come all at once, and it came without thunder. Just a thin change in the air, the kind only certain people ever learn to feel. Ada Calloway felt it before sunrise. She stood in the yard behind the relief house, a wool shawl pulled tight across her shoulders, and she watched the frost. It clung to the north side of the fence posts in pale white lace. The south side stayed dark and wet with mud. 3 weeks too soon. She had seen that pattern only twice in her life. Both times, the snow had come down hard enough to bury the low roads. Both times, her husband had been alive to see it with her. Now she stood alone. Beside her, an old hound named Juno refused to lie down near the north wall. The dog circled once, low to the ground, ears flat, then settled on the far side of the building, facing the dark line of the mountains. Ada noticed that. She noticed everything. Inside her coat pocket sat a worn notebook, its cover soft as cloth from years of handling. The pages were filled with another person's writing. Temperatures, wind, the way elk moved when the high country turned against them, a dead man's notebook, and she was the only one left who could read it. That morning, after the bread was cut and the children fed, Ada tried to tell them. She did not raise her voice. She had never been a woman who needed to. She simply said what the signs said, that winter was coming early, and it would come hard, and the town had a narrow window to get ready. Double the firewood, salt more meat. Brace the weak roofs before the heavy storms arrived. The room went quiet in that particular way. A room goes quiet when people have already decided not to believe you. Reverend Silas Crane spoke first. He was a tall man with a soft voice and hard eyes, and he had a gift for making other people feel small while sounding kind. He folded his hands. He looked at her the way one looks at a child, or at something broken. "Grief does strange things to a person," he said gently. "Ada lost her husband not so long ago. It would be a mercy to let her rest, not to fill the whole town with her fear." A few people lowered their eyes, not because they agreed, because it was easier than disagreeing. Then Della Mott spoke. Della ran the relief house with a thin mouth and thinner patience. She was a woman near Ada's own age, and there had once been something almost like friendship between them, long ago, before the years hardened around them both. "We can't afford panic," Della said. "Supplies are tight enough already. I won't have the children frightened over frost on a fence." That was all. No cruelty in it. Just a door closing. Ada said nothing. She had learned over a long life that the loudest answer a person can give is sometimes silence. But there was one man in that valley who was not content with silence. His name was Boyd Sutter. He stood near the back of the room with his arms crossed and a slow smile on his face. The smile of a man who had been waiting a long time for this exact moment. "Funny thing," he said, "the Callaways always did know an awful lot about winter supplies." The room turned toward him. "Her husband," Boyd went on, louder now. "Back when food ran short, folks say more than a little went missing from the winter stores. Strange how a man who reads the weather so well always seemed to know which wagons to be near." It was a lie. Ada knew it was a lie. The shape of it, the cruelty of it, the way it was built to land soft and spread fast. But a lie does not need to be true to do its work. It only needs to be repeated in a cold room full of frightened people. She watched it land. She watched the faces around her shift, just slightly, away from her. The way frost spreads across a window. Quiet. Total. She did not defend herself. There is a kind of exhaustion that comes from defending yourself to people who have already chosen what to believe. Ada had reached it years ago, so she gathered her shawl and she walked out into the gray morning, and she let the door close behind her. That evening, the temperature dropped hard enough to stiffen the mud in the wagon ruts before dark. A thin boy named Toby Hale slipped out the back door of the relief house with half a biscuit hidden in his sleeve. He was small for his age, with a slight limp he tried to hide, and a watchfulness that made him seem older than he was. He crouched beside Juno near the woodshed and fed the old dog in tiny pieces, so no one inside would see. The dog took the food gently. Then Toby looked up at Ada, and his voice came out small in the cold. "They're wrong, aren't they?" It was not a question. Ada knelt down to his level, slow, the way her knees allowed these days. She looked at this boy who had no one, and who had still come out into the dark to feed her dog. "Keep warm, Toby," she said, "and keep your eyes on the north side of things." He nodded like she had handed him a secret. Then the back door opened. Della Motte stood there with a lamp in her hand, and her face hardened the moment she saw the boy outside in the cold. "Inside!" she snapped. "Now!" Toby flinched, and Juno, old tired Juno, stepped between them, not growling, not snarling, just standing there, low and steady, her body a quiet wall between the woman and the child. For one long second, nobody moved. Then Toby looked back at Ada, and he asked the question that would follow her up into the mountains. "If you're right," he whispered, "what happens to all of us?" Ada had no answer that a child should have to hear, so she gave him the only thing she had. "Believe what your own eyes tell you," she said, "even when grown folks tell you not to." That night, Della told her she could not stay. Not cruelly. Della was rarely cruel. She said it the way people say hard things when they have convinced themselves it is for the best. That a town simmering with Boyd Sutter's poison was no place for Ada now, that it was better for everyone if she was simply gone before the talk grew teeth. The door closed behind her after midnight. It closed slow, with a soft final sound that carried across the frozen yard. Ada stood there a long moment. In one hand she held her husband's weather notebook wrapped in oilcloth. In her coat pocket rested a single black iron key, cold as the night around it, a key her husband had given her years ago, with a strange instruction she had never fully understood. Find the place where the black stone grows out of the mountain. She had thought, back then, that it was just an old man's poetry. Now she was not so sure. Juno pressed against her leg, already facing west, toward the mountains, toward the dark. The dog never once looked back at the town, and neither, in the end, did Ada. The valley slept behind her beneath thin chimney smoke and weak lantern light, warm and certain and wrong. Somewhere a loose sheet of tin slapped softly in the rising wind. The wind was coming from the mountains now. Not the west. The mountains. She had only ever heard it blow like that once before. Ada Calloway pulled her shawl tight, set the dead man's notebook against her chest, and walked out past the last fence line into a cold that the whole valley swore was not coming. She did not know yet what waited for her up there in the black rock. She only knew that staying meant freezing slowly, among people who would rather watch her vanish than admit she had been right. So she chose the mountain, and the mountain, unlike the town, had never once called her a liar. The mountains do not care who you are. That was the first lesson, and the mountain taught it before she had walked an hour past the last fence line. It does not care what the town called you, or whether the right woman was wronged. It does not care that your knees ache in the cold, or that the man who taught you these slopes is in the ground, or that you are walking into the dark with nothing but an old dog and a dead man's notebook held against your chest like a second heart. The mountain simply is. And Ada Calloway walked into it anyway, because the only thing waiting behind her was a slow and certain disappearing. By the time the first gray light touched the high ridges, the valley was gone from sight. The road had thinned to a trail. The trail had thinned to the memory of a trail, and the snow had begun to move, not falling, moving, fine and dry, hissing low across the frozen ground in thin, pale streaks. The kind of snow that arrives before the real snow. The kind that travels sideways and whispers against the rocks and warns anyone wise enough to listen. Ada was wise enough. She had always been wise enough. That was part of what the town could never forgive. Juno trotted ahead and circled back, ahead and back, never letting more than a few steps open up between them. The old dog's breath came in small white clouds. Her nose stayed close to the ground, reading the earth the way Ada read the sky. And now and then she would stop and lift her head and stare off toward the high country at something Ada could not see. Each time the dog did that, Ada felt the cold tighten its grip on her chest. They climbed. By the second day, the cold had begun to take her apart, one small piece at a time. It took the feeling from her fingertips first. Then it cracked the skin across her knuckles until thin lines of blood marked every piece of wood she touched. The bread in her pack froze hard as stone by morning, then went damp and sour by afternoon when it thawed against her body. Her shawl stiffened with frost. Her shoulders burned from the climbing. Her breath came short and shallow in the thin mountain air. And somewhere on that second afternoon, sitting on a cold gray rock with her hands shaking too hard to strike a match, the doubt found her. It came quietly. It always comes quietly. Doubt does not arrive with thunder. It arrives in the small voice that sounds almost like reason. What if you were wrong? What if the whole valley was right, and you are nothing but a grieving old woman chasing a dead man's poetry up a mountain that will be your grave? What if there is nothing up here at all? No door, no black stone, only the cold and the dark and the slow forgetting. For one long moment, Ada nearly turned back. She thought of the warm relief house, the lamplight, the smell of bread, the simple animal comfort of being indoors with other living people, even people who had decided to stop believing her. It would be so easy to go back, to say she was sorry, to let them be kind to her in the small, suffocating way they were kind to broken things. To let the Reverend pat her hand and tell her that grief does strange things to a person, to vanish gently the way they wanted. And then Juno pressed against her side. The old dog took the hem of her sleeve in her teeth and tugged, gently at first, then harder, until Ada stopped reaching for the matches she did not have the strength to light, and simply sat still and looked at the animal looking up at her. "All right," she said. "All right." And for the first time since the door had closed behind her, she opened the notebook. She had read it 100 times. The temperatures, the wind notes, the careful, patient handwriting of a man who had spent more of his years on these slopes than in any town. She knew the pages the way she knew the lines of her own hands. But this time, something slid loose from between two of them. A folded square of oil paper. She knew the handwriting before she even unfolded it. She would have known it in the dark, by touch alone. It was the same hand that had once written her name on the inside cover of a book, long ago, when they were young, and the cold had felt like an adventure instead of a sentence. Her stiff fingers fumbled the folds open. If you are reading this, then the valley has finally done the thing it always wanted to do. Ada stopped breathing. Don't waste your warmth arguing with people who refuse to look at the snow. You will never win, and you will only freeze trying. Go west. Find the black stone. I left something there for you long ago, in case the day ever came. It will come. I know these people, and I know you. Below the words, drawn in faded pencil, was a rough map, a ridge, a line of cliffs, and a small mark low along the rock where the black stone grew out of the mountain. Ada pressed her bare hand flat against the page. For a long while she did not move. The wind walked through the timber above her like distant water, and the dead man's words sat warm in her lap, warmer than the coat across her shoulders, warmer than anything the valley had ever given her. He had known. Years before he died, before the sickness took him quiet in their bed, he had known that one day she would be standing exactly here, alone, half frozen, with nowhere left to go but up. And he had left her a door. Ada folded the paper, slow and careful, The way you fold something you intend to keep for the rest of your life. She tucked it back into the notebook. She rose, and her knees fought her, and she let them fight, and she stood anyway. "All right, Samuel," she said softly, to the snow and the wind and the dog. "Show me." Late on the third afternoon, she found it. The black stone rose out of the mountainside like something that had burned long ago and never finished cooling. Dark and sharp against the white, its deep cracks lined with thin veins of snow. The wind screamed across the ridge above it, hard enough to tear the breath from her mouth. And there, half buried beneath a tangle of dead brush and drifted snow, sat a narrow wooden door. Old, weathered to silver gray, nearly swallowed by the mountain itself. The lock had frozen solid. Ada drew the black iron key from her coat. Her hands shook so badly that she dropped it once into the snow and had to dig for it with fingers that no longer fully belonged to her. She forced it into the frozen lock and turned, and nothing happened. She turned harder. Nothing. For a moment, the doubt rose up again, cruel and certain. Wrong door. Wrong mountain. Wrong life. She set both hands on the key. She put her shoulder against the wood, and she pushed with everything a tired, grieving, 60-winter body had left in it. The metal gave way with a deep, cracking groan that echoed back into the dark. The door swung inward, and the darkness swallowed everything. Ada stood on the threshold, breathing hard, snow swirling at her back. And she noticed the first strange thing almost at once. No wind. Inside, the air did not move. No knife-edge cold cutting through her coat. No hiss of blowing snow. Just a deep, complete stillness. The kind of silence that presses against your ears and makes your own heartbeat sound loud. She stepped inside. Juno went past her into the shadows, low and careful, nose working the dark. The old dog circled once near a dry slab of stone, and then lay down with a long, slow breath, as though she had finally reached the place she had been walking toward her whole life. Ada struck a match. The third try caught. The small flame trembled, steadied, and threw its weak gold light across the stone. And she saw the second strange thing. Along one wall, a narrow stream of water moved quietly over the rock, moving, not frozen. In a cold, deep enough to turn bread to ice, the water ran free and dark and alive. She knelt beside it and laid her bare hand flat against the stone. It was not warm, not the way a fire is warm. But it was not the killing cold of the world outside either. There was a faint, deep heat in the rock, weak, barely there, but real, as though somewhere far below the mountain, a low and patient fire had been burning since before anyone alive was born. And then she saw the third thing, letters carved into the black stone near the stream, worn smooth by years of a thumb passing over them. S.C. Samuel's mark. Ada pressed her hand over the carved letters, and something in her chest finally gave way. Something she had been holding clenched tight since the night the door closed behind her. Since long before that, if she was honest. Since the morning she had woken beside a man who would not wake again. She did not weep. Not quite. She simply sat there, in the dark, with her dead husband's name beneath her palm, and his old dog breathing slow beside the running water. And for the first time in longer than she could measure, she stopped bracing herself against the world. She had not been chasing poetry. She had been walking, all this time, toward the last room he ever built for her. But a door that keeps the wind out is not the same as a place that keeps a person alive. Ada knew that. She had heard Samuel say it 100 times, in 100 different ways, on 100 cold evenings beside their own small fire. A roof is not warmth, Ada. Warmth is work. Warmth is something you defend every single day against a world that would rather you froze. So the next morning, she went to work. She climbed back up into the timber above the black ridge, and she dragged dead wood down the slope, one length at a time. Her shoulders screamed. Her breath came ragged. The thin air left her dizzy if she stood too fast. Juno followed behind, stopping now and then to lift her head toward the high country, listening to that something Ada still could not hear. By the third trip down the slope, Ada could barely lift the hatchet. She did not stop. She had buried a husband. She had been called a liar in front of every soul she knew. She had been turned out into the dark at midnight by a woman who had once almost been her friend. A slope of dead wood was nothing. Near the entrance, she began to build a wall to break the cold. Willow branches woven into a rough lattice, packed thick with clay she scraped from the stream bed, bound with strips torn from a worn blanket. Heavy slabs of black stone formed the base, set low where the dampest, heaviest air gathered closest to the floor. The work moved slowly. The clay froze solid in the bucket if she left it too near the door. Her cracked knuckles split open again and again until the handle of every tool wore a thin, dark stain. And on the second night, she tried to build a fire. She found a narrow crack in the ceiling, a natural chimney where the smoke could rise and escape. She laid her fire carefully beneath it. She lit it. It failed almost at once. The smoke did not rise. It rolled. It came back down into the cave in a thick, choking gray wave. It spread along the ceiling. It filled the small space. It stung her eyes and clawed down her throat and turned the warm dark into something that wanted to kill her. Within moments, Juno was coughing. Hard. The old dog stumbled away from the fire, head low, her whole body shaking with each wet, rattling cough. That sound moved Ada faster than her own burning lungs ever could have. She killed the flames with handfuls of dirt and ash, fast, choking, her eyes streaming. She dragged the dog low to the floor, near the entrance, where the air was clearer, and she held her there until the coughing eased. Then she sat in the smoke and the dark, with the notebook open across her knees, and the cold creeping back in now that the fire was dead. And the doubt came for her a third time. You cannot do this. You are not him. You watched a master work, and you mistook watching for knowing. You are going to die in the dark in a hole he dug, and the town will never even learn that you were right. Ada let the thought sit there. She did not fight it. Fighting it would only feed it. She just breathed, slow, through the fading smoke, and somewhere underneath all the grief and the fear, a voice surfaced. Samuel's voice, standing beside an old fire on a cold night years gone. telling her something she had only half listened to at the time, the way a person half listens to the people they assume they will always have. Smoke doesn't climb toward openings, Ada. Everybody thinks it does. It doesn't. Smoke climbs toward pressure. Build for the pressure, not the hole, and it'll find its own way out. Ada lifted her head in the dark. The next morning, she lit a single candle, and she moved it slowly around the dead hearth, watching nothing but the flame. Near the ceiling crack, where the smoke should have flowed, the flame bent sideways, not up, sideways. The draft was wrong. The smoke shelf sat too low. She had trapped the air against itself, and the smoke had found no road but the road back into her lungs. So she tore it all down. She pulled the stonework apart with her bare, swollen hands and started again from nothing. Flat slabs of stone stacked higher, lifting the fire bed up out of the cold air that pooled thickest along the floor. An old sheet of tin from Samuel's stores bent over the flames to make a crude shelf for the smoke to gather beneath, and the crack in the ceiling widened patiently, inch by stubborn inch, with the pry bar and the back of the hatchet. The sound carried deep into the mountain, metal striking stone, stone breaking loose, the wind screaming outside the cave mouth while an old woman knelt in the dark and refused to quit. She thought more than once that night of how Samuel used to do this very work, humming low under his breath, some half-tune she had never learned the name of, and how the silence where his voice should have been was colder than any draft the mountain could push through the stone. It took 2 days. By the end, her hands had swollen so badly she could barely close them around the tools. But she lit the fire again, and this time the flames caught low against the stone. They flickered, they held, and then the draft took hold. The smoke pulled upward, a thin, steady, beautiful gray ribbon, climbing clean toward the ceiling crack instead of rolling back into the room. Ada snatched up the candle and moved it around the hearth, watching, hardly daring to breathe. The flame barely trembled. Outside, the wind slammed the ridge hard enough to shake loose snow from the pines. Inside, the smoke rose clean, and the wet, dark patches along the ceiling began, slowly, to dry into pale gray stone. And then Juno stood. The old dog crossed the cave from the cold side, sniffed the air once, and settled down against the warm stone near the fire. She turned twice, the way old dogs do, and lay down with a long, tired groan. That was how Ada knew it was working. Not from the smoke, not from the heat on her face, from where the dog chose to sleep. That night, for the first time since the door had closed behind her in the valley, Ada lay down beside the fire without the hatchet across her chest. She slept, and the mountain, for one night, let her. 3 mornings later, Juno lifted her head and went completely still. The dog did not bark. That was what frightened Ada. A bark she could have understood. But Juno only rose, crossed to the entrance, and stood there with her nose lifted to the air outside, every muscle drawn tight. Then Ada heard them. Footsteps, slow, careful, heavy enough to belong to an older man carrying weight, or carrying a weapon. She took up the hatchet. She stood just inside the doorway, in the warm dark where she could see out but not be easily seen, and she spoke first. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "The rifle goes into the snow," she said. "Then 15 steps back, and then we'll talk." A long silence answered her. Then, to her surprise, the soft, heavy sound of a rifle laid down in the snow, and boots retreating, counting their distance. Only then did she step out. The man on the ridge was old, weather-cut and gray, his beard rimed white with frost, his coat patched in a dozen places by a hand that clearly had no woman to do it for him. He looked at her with pale, narrowed eyes that had spent a lifetime measuring weather and men, and then his gaze dropped to the hatchet in her hand, to the worn mark carved into its handle. Something moved across his hard old face. "Samuel Calloway carried that mark," he said quietly. Ada did not lower the blade. "And who are you?" she said. "To know it." For a long moment the old man said nothing. The wind moved through the pines above them. Then he looked past her, toward the dark mouth of the cave, and his voice, when it came, had gone soft and far away. "He pulled me into that place once," he said, "after a slide came down off the high ridge and buried half the slope on top of me. Kept me alive in there longer than a man has any business staying alive in deep winter. Fed me. Talked to me when I'd have given up. I'd have died on this mountain 3 separate times, if not for your husband." He met her eyes again. "Name's Roan Carver. I scout these slopes. Have for more years than I like to count." A pause, and something gentler. "I didn't know Samuel had passed. I'm sorry to hear it. He was a better man than this mountain ever deserved." He looked away then, toward the timber, and his jaw tightened around something he did not quite say. "Saved more than just me, that man did. Put out his hand to plenty who were too proud to take it." A short, hard breath. "Some of them are still angry about it all these years on. Funny thing, how a man can come to hate you for trying to keep him alive." Ada did not understand the weight in those words yet, but she would. Juno walked forward then. She sniffed the old man's gloves once, slow and deliberate, the way she judged everything in the world. And then she backed away and sat down against Ada's leg. That settled it more surely than any words could have. Ada lowered the hatchet. "Come in out of the wind, then," she said, "before you freeze solid, proving you mean no harm." Inside, Roan Carver stood near the hearth and watched the smoke vanish clean through the crack overhead. A faint, tired smile crossed his weathered face. "He didn't build a shelter," the old scout murmured, half to himself. "Samuel never did. He built a place where the weather couldn't argue with a person." He shook his head slowly and looked at her with something like wonder. "And here you are, reading it the same way he did, maybe better. He stayed only a few days, and he was careful, in those days, never once to take the work out of her hands. He never reached for her tools. He never rebuilt what she had made. When he saw something she had done well, he said so, plainly. When he saw something that would fail, he said that too. And then he stepped back and let her be the one to mend it. He taught her by working beside her, never in front of her. Hardwood, he showed her, burned slower than pine, and held its coals through the long nights. bedding needed dry air beneath it, or the damp of the ground would crawl up into the blankets by morning and steal a body's heat while it slept. He helped her spread gravel across the muddy ground near the entrance to stop the meltwater from creeping back inside. Most winter shelters, he said once, working a frozen stone loose, don't fail from cold. Folks always brace for the cold. They fail from wet. Cold, you can fight. Wet just waits. Wet is patient. And then, on the morning he left, he stood at the cave mouth and looked back at her, and he said the thing that mattered most. "This is your place now, Ada Calloway. Not his, not mine." He nodded toward the warm dark behind her. "I'll come when the trails let me, but what keeps you alive up here, that's your own 2 hands. Same as it always was. Same as it was for him." Then he shouldered his rifle and walked back out into the white, and the mountain swallowed him whole. Ada stood in the doorway a long while after he had gone. She was not certain she believed him about the 2 hands, but she was beginning at last to want to. The night after Roan left, the cold collapsed. It came fast, after dark. The wind struck the mountain hard enough to shake dust from the ceiling cracks, and along the lower part of the ceiling, where the air ran coldest, thin moisture began to gather, and then to freeze, into pale sheets of ice before the night was even half spent. By the small hours, the blankets felt damp again, and Juno did the thing that frightened Ada most. The old dog abandoned her warm spot by the fire and moved toward the entrance, where the air stayed drier. The cave was breathing wrong again. Ada did not let herself panic. Panic was a luxury for people who had somewhere else to run. Instead, she took up the candle and she moved it slow through the cold dark, watching the flame bend and gutter, learning where the bad air pooled and where the good air moved. She read the room the way Samuel had taught her to read the sky. And then she took up the pry bar and she went to work. She spent that whole night digging a narrow trench beside the smoke channel, a vent to let the cold, heavy air drain low and away instead of rolling endlessly across the floor and stealing the warmth from everything it touched. The clay packed beneath her fingernails. The melt water soaked through her sleeves to the elbow. More than once she stopped, simply to hold the candle up and study the flame, the way the dead man had shown her, the way the living mountain demanded. Her hands had stopped hurting. They had gone numb somewhere in the dark, and she had quietly decided not to notice. And near sunrise, the change came. The ceiling stone began to dry. The moisture thinned along the walls. The cold air stopped pooling around her knees and began instead to slide quietly down and out through the trench she had carved. And Juno crossed the cave, slow, stiff. The old dog circled near the hearth and lay back down in her old spot beside the warm stone, with a sound that was almost a sigh of relief. Ada sat back on her heels, filthy, soaked through, trembling with exhaustion, and she looked at the dog for a long moment in the rising light. "There," she said softly. "There, now. We're learning, you and I. Slow, but we're learning." A week after that, she found the soil. She had been working deeper into the cave, clearing space to store more wood against the heart of winter, when she noticed it. A narrow strip of dark earth beneath a low shelf of black stone, close to where the stream ran along the wall. It was soft. No matter how bitter the nights became, that one strip of ground stayed soft and dark. No steam rose from it. The warmth there was quieter than steam, deep, steady. The same low heat that lived in the stone itself gathered here in the earth where the running water had carried it down out of the mountain's hidden places. Ada knelt beside it for a long time, and then she remembered the seed pouch. It had been at the very bottom of Samuel's old supply sack, wrapped in a square of faded cloth, half forgotten. Onion tops, mountain cress, turnip seed. She had carried it all this way without ever quite knowing why. The way a widow carries things, because throwing them out feels like throwing away the hand that once packed them. Now, kneeling in the warm dark, she understood. He had packed that pouch the same way he had folded the note into the notebook, the same way he had carved his mark into the stone and left the iron key in her keeping, in case the day ever came. Her first attempt failed. She pressed the seeds straight into the warm earth, and within days the damp had gathered too thick beneath them. Several rotted before they ever sprouted. A thin white fungus crept along the soil like frost, like a small mocking echo of the winter outside. Ada did not despair. She had stopped somewhere along the way, expecting the mountain to be kind. She only expected it to be honest. And it was, every time. So she changed the system. She mixed cold fireplace ash into the dark earth to loosen it and dry it. She raised the planting trays up onto flat, dry stones, lifting the seeds clear of the wettest ground. And she cut a narrow vent into the stone overhead, the same trick that had saved the smoke, to carry the damp air up and away. Then she waited. Outside, the snow buried the western ridges to the height of a tall man. The wind hammered the mountain, day and night, an endless gray voice grinding against the black stone. And inside, in the warm dark, with the old dog sleeping beside the heat that rose from the earth, tiny green shoots pushed up through the soil. Ada crouched beside them and did not move for a long, long while. The first small leaf trembled faintly in the warmth rising from beneath the stone. So fragile, so impossibly, stubbornly alive. In the dead center of a winter the entire valley had sworn was still weeks from coming. She reached out, and she touched it once, with the back of one cracked and aching finger. And she did not pick it. She only knelt there in the low firelight. An old woman the world had named a liar and turned out into the dark, looking at something green growing up out of the black earth. And she let herself feel, for one quiet moment, the thing she had not let herself feel in longer than she could remember. Not pride, hope. Behind her, Juno lifted her gray head, watched her for a moment in the gold light, and then lay back down, content, against the warm stone. The wind went on screaming outside the door. It did not matter any more. Far below, in the valley, the town slept in its certainty. Sure that winter was still weeks away. Sure that the grieving widow had wandered off into the high country to freeze among her dead husband's ghosts, and that the matter was closed, and that they need never think on her again. They did not know about the door and the black stone. They did not know about the clean smoke, or the dry bedding, or the warm earth, or the iron key, or the dead man who had thought of all of it years before the need ever came. They did not know that somewhere high above their warm and certain beds, in a cave they would have sworn held nothing but cold and dark, green things were quietly growing. But they would learn. The mountain would see to that. Winter, in the end, always tells the truth. The first great storm came down off the high country after dark. It did not arrive the way the small storms had. Those had been rehearsals, practice runs, the mountain only clearing its throat. This was the mountain finding its full voice. Ada felt it before she ever heard it, a change in the pressure deep behind her ribs, the way a body senses a heavy thing approaching before the eyes can find it. The candle flame leaned toward the wall and would not stand straight. The stream along the rock seemed to run quieter, as if it too were listening, and far up the ridge the wind began to gather itself out of 1,000 small gusts into something single and enormous and alive. Then it struck. It slammed against the black stone hard enough to shake fine dust loose from the ceiling cracks. The snow no longer fell. It flew. It came sideways across the ridge in long dry waves, hissing against the outer wall like something trying to get in. And even deep inside, behind the clay and the woven willow and the heavy slabs of stone, the air carried the low groan of a whole mountain settling under the weight of a winter that had finally, fully arrived. Juno reacted first. The old dog rose from beside the hearth before any sound had even reached the door. The gray fur along her spine stood up in a ridge. A low note rolled through her chest, not quite a growl, more like a warning she had not yet found the shape of. Ada laid another length of hardwood on the fire and watched the smoke climb clean and steady through to the crack overhead. She watched the dry ceiling stay dry. She watched the small green leaves tremble faintly in the warmth that rose from the earth, alive in the dead heart of the cold. Her shelter held. She had torn it down and built it back more than once until the work was hers in a way it had never been Samuel's. And now it held against the worst the mountain could throw. "Let it come," she said softly. To the dog, to the dark, to the dead man whose name was carved into the stone beside the running water. "We're ready for it now, whatever it brings." But far below her, down in the valley that had cast her out, they were not ready at all. The town had not believed the widow, and the snow did not care, one way or the other, what the town had chosen to believe. It buried the fence lines first, until only the upper rails showed above the white, then the wagon roads, then the low paths that ran between the houses, until a man could no longer be certain where the road ended and the frozen creek began beneath the drifts. They went out with long poles to feel their way forward, and came back with frost in their beards and a new kind of quiet in their eyes. The woodpiles, stacked back in the warm autumn for a winter still 3 weeks off, began to shrink. Fast. Faster than anyone wanted to say aloud. And in the relief house, the children began to cough. It started small. One child, then another, in the deepest hours of the night. A thin, wet sound, carrying down the cold hallways where the lamp oil was rationed now and the dark pooled thick. Then it was 3. Then, more than anyone could count lying awake to listen, It was the kind of cough that comes from chests too small, in rooms too cold, under blankets worn too thin to do their work. Della Motte had begun measuring the soup one careful spoonful at a time, and late at night, when no one was awake to see her do it, she had begun to count the flour in the barrels, by lamplight, with her thin mouth pressed thinner. The counting did not take nearly as long as it once had. Each night it took a little less. She did not let her face show anything during the day. She had run that relief house through hard seasons before, and she knew that a frightened keeper makes a frightened house. So she kept her chin level and her voice flat and her hands steady on the ladle. But at night, alone with the barrels, something in her had begun to crack, and the man named Boyd Sutter moved through all of it, like a shadow that had been waiting its whole life for exactly this hour. He did not raise the alarm. He did the opposite. That was the cruel genius of him. He moved from doorway to doorway, from cold stove to cold stove, and wherever he found fear, he fed it, never with shouting, always with a low, reasonable voice, the most dangerous voice there is. "Hard winter," he would murmur, shaking his head slowly, like a man weighed down by sorrow, harder than any soul could have rightly seen coming. And then, gently, as though it pained him to even speak of it. Course, the Callaways always did seem to know a great deal about winter stores. Strange thing, isn't it? A family that read the weather so well always seemed to come through the lean years with full bellies, while honest folk went thin. A lie repeated soft and low, in a cold room full of frightened, hungry people. A lie does not need to be true to do its work. It only needs to be there, waiting, warm. He had a particular gift for it. He never asked anyone to believe him outright. He only set the thought down, gently, beside their fear, and let the two of them keep each other company through the long nights. By the time the great storm closed the last road out of the valley, half the town had half decided that the dead man, Samuel Calloway, had stolen the bread from their own children's mouths in years gone by, and that his widow had fled up the mountain carrying secrets and stores and a warmth that by every right belonged down here with them. Fear is a cold thing. It is always looking for somewhere warmer to go. And Boyd Sutter had spent the whole long autumn standing at the bottom of the mountain, pointing the way up. The night the storm reached its full and screaming worst, the footsteps came. Juno heard them long before Ada did. The old dog went rigid by the door, that low note building and building in her chest, her eyes fixed on the black beyond the wall. Ada set down the wood she was holding and stood still and listened past the howl of the wind. And then she heard them too. Footsteps, more than one set, not the stumbling, half-frozen shuffle of a lost soul searching for shelter. These were steady, deliberate, climbing. The footsteps of men who had come a long, hard way on purpose through a killing storm, carrying their anger up the mountain in front of them like a torch held against the dark. A fist struck the outer door. "Help!" a voice shouted through the wind. "Man's freezing to death out here. For mercy's sake, open up." Ada did not move toward the latch. Neither did Juno, because the voice was wrong. She knew it the way she knew the difference between sleet and snow without looking. Too steady, too controlled, A man truly freezing does not shout like that. A man truly freezing can barely shape a word at all. His voice comes out small and broken and slurred. She had learned that long ago, at the sight of a husband who had pulled more than one half-dead stranger out of the white. This was not a plea. This was a trap, wearing a plea like a borrowed coat. Another blow struck the door, harder this time, and then something heavy, a thick oak branch swung like a club, slammed against the frame. The clay and willow wall she had raised shuddered down to its base. Snow pushed in beneath the lower edge of the door, but it held. "Open the door, you old liar!" The voice had thrown off its mask now. The wind tore it ragged, but she knew it. She had heard it in a warm, bright room, smiling, salting her name with poison, while the town looked away. Boyd Sutter. My father died because of Samuel Calloway. That thief stole the freight meant for the winter camps, and good people went hungry for it, and my father was one of them. You think you get to hide up here, warm, on the back of his stealing? The branch struck again. The wall groaned but did not break. And inside, in the steady firelight, Ada Calloway stood very still, and felt something rise in her chest that was not fear at all. It was older than fear, steadier. It was the thing that had carried her up the mountain in the first place, when turning back would have been so much easier. She picked up the hatchet, not to use it, only to hold it. The honest weight of it settled her hand and slowed her breath. She stepped close to the trembling door, and when she spoke, she did not shout. She let her voice drop low and cold and even, the way a person speaks when they have finished being afraid and started, instead, being certain. My husband never took a single thing in his life that wasn't freely given to him, she said, not once, and whoever told you otherwise was building himself a story he needed. Out of a grief, he never learned how to carry any other way. A pause. The wind screamed across the ridge. "I'm sorry your father died, Boyd Sutter. I am. But you've spent so long blaming a dead man for it. You never once stopped to ask whether the story you were told was even true." The branch did not strike again, but she could feel him out there, coiled, furious. "You go on and hit that door one more time." Her voice still did not rise, and that was what made it terrible. "And the cold out there won't be the most dangerous thing waiting for you on this mountain tonight." Silence. For one long, held breath, there was nothing but the storm. And then, from somewhere high above the cave, up along the bare ridge where no sane man would choose to stand in such a wind, a rifle cracked. The sound slammed through the mountainside like splitting timber, rolling down the slope and echoing off the black stone in long, hard waves. It was not aimed at any living thing. It did not need to be. It was a single hard word, spoken in a language every man on that mountain understood without translation. Enough. Outside, the assault stopped at once. Ada heard boots scrambling backward across the snow and loose rock. She heard Boyd Sutter's voice, smaller now, swallowed and scattered by the wind, cursing as he and the men with him broke and fled back down toward the trees, toward the half-buried trail, toward the valley that had sent them up into the dark. And then there was only the storm again, only the wind, only the snow hissing against the wall, only the fire burning low and steady and faithful in the dark. Ada let out a long breath and lowered the hatchet, and only then did she let herself look down at the dog. Juno was trembling, not from cold. The old dog lay pressed close against the warm stone, well within the heat of the hearth. She was shaking from something else entirely, something Ada knew the exact shape of, because she had carried it inside her own body for a long time now. Fear. Old fear. The kind that does not leave when the danger leaves. The kind that stays in the bones long after the thing that put it there is gone and rises up again at the smallest sound in the dark. Ada knelt, slow, her knees protesting the cold stone, and she gathered the shaking dog against her chest, and she held her there in the firelight until the trembling finally began to ease. "I know," she murmured into the gray fur. "I know, old girl. I know. People are harder to weather than any storm that ever blew. The wind you can build a wall against. People get inside you and stay." Roan Carver came in through the wall a few minutes later. He carried snow across his shoulders and the sharp, clean bite of the cold on his coat, and his hands shook as he pulled off his gloves by the fire. He had been the rifle up on the ridge. He said nothing of it at first. He simply crossed to the hearth and sat down heavily and held his trembling hands out toward the warmth and stared down into the coals for a long while before any words came. When they finally did, his voice was low and worn. "Haven't fired near a living man in more years than I care to count," he said. "Told myself I never would again." He turned his old hands over slowly in the firelight, studying them like they belonged to someone else. Folks think a thing like that gets easier with time. It doesn't. You just get better at carrying it. Ada poured something hot from the iron kettle and pressed it into his shaking hands without a word. Juno crossed the cave and lay down between the two of them, her head settling onto her paws, her body, at last, going still. For a while, none of them spoke. The storm filled all the silence there was. Then Roan told her, in the slow, halting way of a man who almost never let the words out of him, about the winters he had known, the hard ones, the high camps that went quiet in the night, the men who lived through the storm itself, and then carried the cold around inside their own chests for the rest of their days, never quite warm again. He had spent a long life finding people too late, after the thaw uncovered them, and some days, he said, he could no longer tell which cold had truly killed them, the one that came down off the mountain, or the one they had let take root inside. Ada listened. She did not rush him. She had learned in a long marriage that some men give you the truest things only in the spaces between their words. She looked toward the entrance, where the wind drove the snow past the cracks in pale, flying ribbons. "That storm out there," she said quietly, when he had finished. "It doesn't hate a single one of us. It doesn't know my name. It doesn't remember what the town called me, or what Boyd's father did or didn't do all those years ago. It has no grudge in it at all. It just is. It does only what winter has always done, since long before any of us, and long after." She turned the kettle a little on the coals. It's people who carry the bitterness from one season into the next. People who keep the cold alive long after the storm itself has moved on and forgotten us. Roan was quiet a moment, looking into the fire. Then he nodded, slow and tired, and gave her own words back to her, made simpler, the way an old man makes things simple. The storm don't remember who you are, he said. People do. That's the whole trouble with people. A few mornings later, after the worst of that first great storm had blown itself out, Roan came down off the ridge through snow that reached past his knees, and he brought something down with him, a folded scrap of paper tucked carefully inside his coat, held against the cold like something that might freeze. "Boy sent it," he said. "Slipped it to me at the edge of the timber, down where the trail's still half open. Took some nerve, a child crossing that far alone in weather like this." He held it out to her. "Wouldn't tell me a word of what it said, only that it had to reach you. No one else." Ada knew the boy at once before the paper was even open. Toby Hale, the thin child with the slight limp he tried so hard to hide, and the watchful eyes that made him seem far older than his years. The boy who had crouched in the dark and fed her dog so no one inside would see. The boy who had asked her the question she still carried, the one she had no good answer for. "If you're right, what happens to all of us?" She unfolded the paper carefully beside the fire. The writing leaned and stumbled across the page, the careful, painstaking labor of a child who did not often get the chance at a pencil, and meant every letter. The children at the relief house had begun coughing through the nights, it said. The flour barrels were nearly empty now. The woman, Della Mott, measured out the soup 1 spoon at a time. And some people still called the widow a liar whenever her name came up near the warm chapel stove. Ada read it all the way down to the bottom, and there, at the very end, written smaller than all the rest, pressed down hard into the paper as though the boy had wanted to make certain it could never be taken back. "I still believe you." For a long while, Ada said nothing at all. She sat by the fire with the child's note in her cracked and aching hands, and the storm muttered low outside, and the warmth rose steady and faithful from the earth where the green things grew. She thought about the coughing in the dark, the thin small chests, the empty barrels that Della counted alone at night. She thought about a boy with no one in the world to look out for him, who had crossed a killing trail through the snow, not to ask her for a single thing, only to tell her that he had not stopped believing. Something moved in her chest then, warmer than the fire, older than the grief. And then she rose. She crossed to the warm strip of earth beneath the black stone, where the first small crop had finally grown thick enough to take from. The leaves stood green and impossibly alive, trembling faintly in the heat that breathed up out of the hidden heart of the mountain. She knelt down beside them, slow, and with careful, patient movements, she cut the first handful she had ever harvested from that dark and secret ground. She did not eat a single leaf of it. Instead, she carried it back to the fire, and she found a clean square of cloth, and she folded the green leaves inside it. Carefully, gently, the way a person wraps something precious, something never meant for themselves at all. She set the small bundle down beside the boy's note. "Not yet," she murmured, mostly to herself, to the dog, to the dead man in the stone. They won't believe in the greens first. That part comes later, when they're ready for it. The believing comes last with people like that. She looked into the fire a long moment, the light moving across her tired face. But the children get to eat, she said, low and certain, whether they believe me or not, whether they ever say my name kindly again or not. The children get to eat. Outside, the wind was already beginning to rise once more. A second storm, gathering itself somewhere up in the dark above the ridge, the way they always did in the deep of the season. One after another, each pushing deeper into the cold heart of the winter. But inside the black stone, an old woman sat by a steady, faithful fire. An old dog slept at her feet, finally still. And a child's 7 small words lay beside a handful of green leaves grown out of frozen, secret ground. For the first time, the warmth in that cave was not only the warmth of the fire or the warmth that rose from the earth. It was the warmth of being believed, even by only one person, even by a child, with a stub of pencil in the dark. Sometimes that is enough to carry a soul through a long winter. Sometimes that one small thing is everything. By the deep of winter, the valley had stopped pretending the season might still loosen its grip. The roads were gone, not blocked, gone. Buried so deep that the men who went out with long poles to feel for the edges could no longer find them at all. And so, one by one, they stopped going out. The drifts climbed the sides of the houses until they swallowed the lower windows. Smoke rose from every chimney, day and night, and grew thinner each morning as the wood piles shrank down toward bare frozen ground. And the coughing in the relief house had grown worse. It was no longer only a thing of the deep night. It carried through the cold gray days as well now, a thin, wet sound in too many small chests, rising and falling along the dark hallways. The soup grew weaker with every passing evening, and Della Mott had finally stopped counting the flour, because there was no longer enough of it left to be worth the counting. The town was running out of everything that mattered: wood, food, time, and somewhere in the worst hours of one long, screaming night, a mother walked out into the storm to save her child. Because staying still by the fire meant watching him die, and that was the one thing she could not do. The knock came different this time. Not the steady, deliberate fist of angry men. Not the heavy crack of a club against the frame. Not the false plea of a voice too controlled to be truly freezing. This was weak, frantic. The sound of a hand that had almost no strength left in it, striking the door because it had nothing else to give. Juno was at the door before Ada had even risen from the fire, but the old dog did not bristle. She did not growl. She stood with her nose pressed to the narrow gap beneath the door, and her tail moved once, low and uncertain, and she looked back at Ada with something in her old eyes that was not warning at all. It was urgency. Ada lifted the latch. The storm shoved the door inward the moment it was free, and with it came a woman, half frozen, snow-caked solid to the waist of her skirts, her lips already gone the gray of the dying. She stumbled across the threshold and went straight down to her knees on the cold stone, and even as she fell, she did not loosen her arms from the bundle she carried against her chest. She had no strength left to hold up her own body, but she would not let go of that bundle. Not for anything. It was a child, a small boy, wrapped in every blanket the woman owned, layer on layer. And even through all that wool, Ada heard it at once, the sound coming out of him, thin, wet, rattling, the terrible sound of air being dragged through water, in a chest where water had no business being. Ada knew the woman's face, though it had been a long while since they had spoken. Marin Pike, younger than Ada by a good many years, the sister of the man who kept the supply room down in the valley. She had never once been cruel to Ada, in all the years they had known one another. But she had never been brave for her either. That day in the cold, crowded room, when the whole town turned its face away, Marin had only looked down at her own shoes, the way so many of them had, and let it happen, and said nothing. Now she knelt on Ada's stone floor with her dying son in her arms, and she did not say one word about any of it. She did not apologize. She did not try to explain why, out of all the doors in the world, she had crawled through a killing storm to this one. She did not beg. She only lifted her head, with the snow melting down her gray, frozen face, and she held the child out toward the old woman the town had named a liar. Ada took him without a single question, because there is a kind of judgment that has no place beside a sick child. Ada had learned that long ago, across a long life. Whatever lay buried and frozen between two grown women could keep. It could wait by the cold for as long as it needed to. The boy could not wait. "Get her close to the fire," Ada said, and Marin obeyed like a woman moving through a dream, dragging herself the last few feet across the floor toward the warm stone, while Ada carried the child to the hearth and laid him down in the light, and began, with quick and certain hands, to peel away the heavy blankets. He was burning, fever hot through every layer, his small chest laboring, each breath hauling that awful wet rattle behind it like a chain. His eyes were half open and seeing nothing at all. His lips had gone dusky at the edges. Ada had seen this before. She had seen it at the side of her own husband in the last hard season of his life, when she had sat up night after night, learning the difference between a fever that would break and one that would not. She had seen it in younger years, too, in other beds, in other dark rooms. And so her hands knew what to do before her mind had finished forming the thought. She built the fire higher, fast, feeding it the good hardwood. She swung the iron kettle out over the flames and filled it with clean water drawn straight from the running stream along the wall. And from the old supply bundles that Samuel had packed and left behind, the ones she had carried all the way up the mountain without ever quite knowing why. She drew out what she needed: willow bark for the fever in his small body, spruce tips, sharp and green, dried mullein, soft and gray, the old remedy for a chest drowning in itself. She crushed them into the boiling water with her cracked fingers, and the steam rose thick and fragrant into the warm dark, filling the whole cave with the clean, sharp smell of pine and bitter wood and something older than memory. Then she lifted the boy, gentle as anything, and held him up into the rising steam, and draped a blanket over the both of them like a small tent, to catch the warm vapor close around his struggling face. "Breathe," she murmured to him, low, steady. The same voice she had once used on frightened horses and frightened children, and her own frightened heart in the dark of too many nights. Breathe it in, little one. Slow now. There you go. That's it. You don't have to do a thing but breathe. I've got you. Maren watched from the floor, shaking with the cold and with terror, unable to help, unable to look away from the sight of it. The woman she had failed to defend, now bent over her dying son in the firelight, fighting to give him back his breath. And then Juno crossed the cave and lay down against the boy's bare feet. The old dog had never done that before. Not for Ada, in all their nights together. Not for Roan. But she lay down now, deliberate, pressing her warm body close along the child's cold, small feet, and she did not move from that spot again for the whole of the long night. The hours that came after that came slow, and they came hard. Ada worked through every one of them. She kept the steam rising, refilling the kettle from the stream when it ran low. She bathed the boy's burning forehead with cloth dipped in cool water, then turned and warmed his cold feet against the patient dog, fighting the fever from both ends at once, the way the old knowledge taught, the way her own hands remembered. She tipped small, careful sips of the bitter willow tea between his cracked lips each time he surfaced near enough to the waking world to swallow. She did not sleep. The thought did not even occur to her. Maren did not sleep either. She sat pressed against the warm stone with her hands clasped tight over her mouth, watching, through the slow, terrible hours, the old woman she had let the town cast out, now spending herself completely to save what mattered most to her in all the world. And somewhere in the deepest, darkest part of that night, the hard, wet rattle in the boy's chest began, little by little, to ease. It did not happen all at once. It never does. The breaths came slower first, then deeper, then slowly, quieter. The terrible drowning sound thinned, and thinned again, and at last faded into something that was very nearly the ordinary sound of a tired child sleeping. Ada laid her hand against his forehead. The fever had broken. His skin was cooler now, damp with honest sweat instead of that frightening dry heat. She sat back on her heels there on the cold stone, and she let out a long breath she felt she had been holding in her chest since the moment the door first blew open. "There," she whispered. "There now. You stubborn little thing. You're going to be all right. You hear me? You're going to be just fine." Across the fire, Maren Pike made a sound that was half a sob and half her son's name, and she crawled the last few feet to him and gathered him up against her and rocked him, her face buried in his hair, her whole body shaking with the kind of crying that comes only after the worst has finally passed. And it was then, with the fear finally drained out of the room, that Maren lifted her wet face and saw them. The plants, the strip of living green growing up out of the black earth beneath the stone, glowing soft and impossible in the firelight, real leaves, mountain cress and turnip greens, and the pale tops of onions, fresh green growing things, alive and thriving, in the very dead center of the hardest winter the valley had ever known. Maren stared at them, and something in her face came quietly apart. She did not say a word. She only looked at those green leaves, and then at the old woman who had grown them with her own hands, the very hands the valley had decided were good for nothing but grieving. The old woman the whole town had stood in a warm room and called a liar, and turned out into the freezing dark to die. And the tears came again, silent now, sliding down her face, and she did not try to stop them this time, because she understood fully in that one moment exactly what the town had thrown away. Not just a strange old widow with her dead husband's notebook, a woman who could read the sky, a woman who could break a fever, a woman who could grow life itself out of frozen stone. Ada said nothing about it. She did not gloat. She did not say the words, "I told you so." She had no use left in her for those small, cold words. They were nothing, and the night had been everything, and the boy was breathing easy now in his mother's arms. She simply rose, slow, her knees aching, and crossed to the warm earth, and cut a generous handful of the greens. She wrapped them in clean cloth, careful, the way she had wrapped the first bundle for the children of the relief house, and she pressed it gently into Marin's hands. "For the boy," she said, "and for the others, if it stretches that far. Boil it down soft. It'll go down easy on a raw little throat." Marin looked at the bundle in her two hands, as though it had been made of pure gold. "Don't tell them about the greens yet," Ada added, quieter now. "Not the part about where it came from, or whose hands grew it. They won't be ready to believe that part first. People never are." A faint, tired warmth moved through her voice. "They'll believe in a healthy child long before they'll believe in an old woman they've already decided to hate. So let the child do the talking for me. A child sleeping through the night says more than I ever could." Marin rested her hand for a long moment against the warm stone of the wall, the way a person touches a thing they still cannot quite believe is real. The look on her face made it plain. She still could not fully believe any of it herself. She left near the gray light of dawn, when the storm had quieted just enough to risk the buried trail, her son sleeping warm and easy in her arms for the first time in many long nights, the small bundle of green tucked safe and close inside her coat. But the storm was not finished with the valley, and it was not finished bringing the lost to Ada's door. 2 nights later, in the very teeth of another blow, Juno stopped at the half-buried entrance and gave a low, uncertain whine. It was not the warning she had given the angry men, nor the urgency she had given the dying child. It was something else entirely, something the old dog seemed to have no clear name for, and did not know what to do with. She would not go any closer to the door. So Ada took up a lamp and went out herself into the swirling dark, leaning into the wind, and there, slumped against the outer wall, already half covered by the drifting snow, she found a woman, Della Mott. Her bare hands had already gone gray with the cold. Her eyes were half shut and glazing. She had climbed the whole mountain alone, through a storm, an aging woman with no earthly business on that killing slope, and she had made it as far as the wall, and no farther. Ada did not waste a single breath on her own shock. She got her arms under the woman and dragged her in out of the wind, and got her down close by the fire, and wrapped her in the heated blankets, while melted snow dripped steadily from her frozen boots onto the stone. She rubbed the gray hands hard between her own. She held warm tea to lips that were, at first, far too cold to hold the cup themselves. For a long time, Della Mott could not speak at all. And when she finally could, her voice came out smaller than Ada had ever once heard it, stripped clean of all its old hardness. Just a tired old woman by a fire at the end of a very long road. My mother was a healer, Della said, staring down into the coals as if she could see something there. Long ago, before any of this, she knew the roots, the barks, the way to coax a fever down out of a child before it could take him. A long pause. The fire snapped softly between the two women. She taught me all of it, Della went on. Every last bit. I was good at it, too. Folk used to come to me. Ada said nothing. She only kept working the warmth back into the cold gray hands. There was a hard season once, Della said, and her voice grew unsteady. A sickness came through the valley, and I did everything my mother had ever taught me. Everything right. Everything I knew. And the children. Her throat worked, and for a moment she could not go on. Some of them died anyway, no matter what I did, no matter how I prayed over them, or sat up with them, or wore my own hands raw, trying. The wind groaned long and low outside the black stone, and the town needed somebody to hold it against, Della whispered. Frightened people always do. They can't hold it against the sickness. The sickness has no face to look at. So they held it against me. The woman who'd promised she could help, and then couldn't save them all. They never forgave me for the ones I couldn't save. Never once thanked me for the ones I did. She finally lifted her face, and her eyes were wet and old and full of something that had been carried far too long. I know what happens, she said, to a person who understands things the rest of them don't. I lived it, Ada. I watched it hollow out my own mother before her time, and then I watched it come for me. Then she reached, slow, with one trembling hand, into her coat, and she drew out something small and dark with age, a compass, old brass, worn smooth by years of a thumb, Samuel's compass. Ada's breath caught hard in her chest. I kept it after he passed, Della said. Not because I hated him. Lord above knows I never hated that man. I kept it because I knew. The moment they started in on you, I knew exactly how it would end, the same way it ended for me. And I thought. Her voice broke and steadied and broke again. I thought, if I could just push you out early enough, before the real hunger set in, before the cold gave them a true reason to turn cruel, maybe they'd only run you off and be done. Maybe they wouldn't finish it. Maybe you'd live somewhere, even if it was far from here. The cave was silent now, but for the wind and the low shifting of the coals beneath the hearth. I wasn't trying to destroy you, Ada, Della whispered. God forgive me for how it must have looked. I was trying to pull you clear of it, out of the path of the thing that took everything from me. It was the only way I knew how to keep you safe, the only way I had. For a long moment, Ada did not move at all. So many cold years stood between these two women. So much silence, so much that had looked, from the outside, like plain cruelty, and had been, underneath all of it, a frightened woman trying, in the only broken and clumsy way she knew, to spare another woman from her own old, unhealed wound. Ada took the compass from Della's shaking hand. She turned it once in the firelight, watching the worn old brass catch and hold the glow. Samuel's compass, the very thing that had guided him home to her through more storms than she could ever count across all their years together. And then she placed it back, gently, into Della's open palm, and she folded the old woman's cold fingers closed around it and held them there a moment, warm in her own. "Keep it," Ada said softly. Samuel would have wanted it to stay with someone who knows what it costs to see clearly in a place that punishes people for seeing at all. Della Mott bowed her gray head, and the tears came at last, the kind held back for far too many years, the kind that have nowhere left to go but out. And Ada did not look away from them, and she did not try to stop them, and she did not fill the silence with empty comfort. She only sat there beside the steady fire with the other woman in the warm and living dark. Two old women, both of them blamed in their own seasons for the crime of seeing too clearly, both of them cast out into the cold for it, finding one another at last at what had felt like the very end of the world, by the only fire still left burning in all that frozen dark. Hours later, when exhaustion finally pulled Della Mott down into sleep beside the hearth, her fingers still curled around the old brass compass, Juno rose, slow and stiff with her years, and crossed the quiet cave, and the old dog lay down, gently, across Della Mott's feet, the very same way she had lain across the sick child's feet 2 nights before, as if she understood, as if some deep and patient animal wisdom in her knew that this woman, too, had been out in the cold a very long time, and needed, at last, to be let back in. By the heart of winter, the valley had finally come to the end of its certainty. There was nothing left to ration. The flour barrels stood empty and echoing, and the children had stopped asking when supper would come, which was somehow worse than the asking. The wood piles had shrunk to splinters and swept up bark, and the cold had stopped feeling like weather at all. It felt like a presence now, a thing with patience, settling over the rooftops, waiting for the valley to give up the last of its warmth. Then, before dawn, one gray morning, the supply roof came down. It went all at once, with a sound that carried clear across the buried valley, like thunder rolling up out of the frozen ground. The weight of the snow, gathered storm upon storm upon storm, had finally found the breaking point of the old beams. Wet snow and splintered timber crashed down over what little grain remained and buried it deep beneath the wreckage where no shovel would easily reach it. By noon, the whole town understood the one thing no soul among them had been willing to say aloud all winter long. They could not survive the rest of the season alone. Not by praying over it, not by waiting it out, not by pretending the snow would stop simply because they needed it to. And so the men did the only thing left in the world to do. They turned, at last, toward the mountain. They gathered a sled and tied ropes across their shoulders and loaded it with what little they could spare, which was very nearly nothing. And then they began to climb, toward the black ridge, toward the widow they had cast out into the dark all those long weeks ago, for the unforgivable crime of having been right. The man who kept the supply room came, his face hollow now where it had once been heavy. The Reverend came too, the tall man with the soft voice, the one who had stood before a warm and trusting crowd and called her fear a sickness that spread faster than weather. 3 other men climbed with them, ropes biting deep into their shoulders, breath tearing out of them in ragged clouds. The climb took the whole of the short winter day. The wind tore across the open slope without a shred of mercy. Twice the sled rolled sideways into the deep drifts, hard enough to nearly drag the men off their feet and down the mountain after it. Frost gathered white in the Reverend's beard until his face looked carved from salt and bone. And still they climbed, because below them their children were coughing in the dark, and there was nowhere else left to go. And then, near the last of the failing light, they saw the smoke, thin, steady, rising clean and straight up from the black stone into the freezing air. Not the desperate, guttering smoke of a fire fighting just to stay alive. Not the panicked smoke of green wood and bad draft. The smoke of a fire that had been mastered, tended, defended, day after day and night after night, against everything the mountain could throw at it. The smoke of control. The men stopped on the slope, ropes slack in their frozen hands, and they stared up at that thin gray line, and not one of them said a single word. Ada opened the door before they ever reached it to knock. She had felt them coming, or perhaps Juno had, and had told her in the only way the old dog knew, with that low sound and that turn of the head toward the slope. Either way, Ada stood in the open doorway with the warmth of the cave rolling out past her into the bitter cold. And she watched them come the last few weary steps up toward her. The warmth reached them before her face did. It was not the easy heat of a hearth in a comfortable house. It was something harder won than that, and stranger. Heat that had been fought for and kept and defended through every single night of that long dark. Stable, dry, alive. The men stepped inside, one by one, out of the killing wind. And they stopped. They stood there in the warm and steady dark, breathing steam into the still air, snow melting from their coats, and running in small streams across the worn stone floor. And they looked, slowly, at what an old woman had built here with her own hands, in a place every one of them had written off, weeks ago, as a grave with the door already shut. The clean smoke rising true through the stone, the strips of venison curing dark above the smoke shelf, the dry bedding, the gravel kept dry near the door, the walls that still held the warmth of the day's fire long after dark, and there, deep in the cave, beneath the black stone, beside the quiet running water, the plants, green, living, mountain cress and turnip greens and the pale tops of onions, growing thick and impossible and unafraid in the very dead center of the cruelest winter the valley had ever known. No one said that Ada Calloway had been right. No one needed to. No one would have dared to say a thing so plainly true. The proof of it stood all around them. In the warm stone, the cured meat, the dry beds, the clean, steady draft, the green leaves glowing soft in the firelight. Every single thing she had warned them to do that morning in the cold, crowded room, and 100 things more they had never even thought to fear. All of it done and kept and living. while their own town lay buried and starving in the dark below. The man who kept the supply room lowered his eyes first. He could not hold them up against what he saw. And the Reverend, the tall man who had named her a danger to them all. He slipped the small bundle of firewood from his frost-burned shoulder, and he set it down, quiet, against the wall by the hearth. A poor thing, a small thing, all he had thought to bring her, and worth nothing to a woman who had more wood than he did. He did not look directly at her while he did it. He could not. Ada watched them all from beside her fire, and she waited for the feeling she had once been so sure would come. The triumph. The hot rush of being proven right in front of the very people who had turned their faces from her. On all those bitter early nights, she had imagined this exact moment and imagined it would taste sweet. But standing in it now, at last, she felt none of that. She felt only something quiet and tired and very, very old. These were not monsters who stood dripping melted snow on her floor. They were only frightened people who had chosen the easy thing over the true thing when the choosing was put before them. And now they were paying for that choice, in cold and in hunger, and in the shame of having to climb a mountain to beg from a woman they had thrown away. She had been frightened once, too. She knew the full weight of it. "There's room by the fire," she said. There was no warmth in the words, and no spite in them either. Only the flat truth of a woman with a fire to spare and a winter to outlast. "And there'll be food enough to send down for the children. Sit. Get the cold out of your bones first. We'll talk about what the valley needs once you can feel your own hands again." For a long moment, none of them moved. They did not seem to know how to accept a kindness from a person they had wronged so deeply. It was the Reverend who finally spoke. His soft voice had lost every ounce of its old certainty. It came out rough and low and unsteady. "We were wrong about you," he said. "I was wrong about you. There is no mending the shape of what we did. I know that. But I will say it. Here, in front of these men who heard me say the opposite. I was wrong. You were right. And children suffered for the distance between the two." The cave was quiet, but for the fire. Ada looked at him a long while. "Don't say it to me," she said at last. "I already know it. I've known it all winter. Every cold night of it." She held his eyes, steady. "Say it down there, in the valley, to the people who learned to repeat your words after you, the ones who'll teach their own children what to believe. Say it where it can do some good." The Reverend bowed his head, and he gave her, then, the one thing she had asked for, the only thing that had ever actually mattered. "I will," he said. "I give you my word. They'll hear it from me. Every soul down there will hear that you were right, and that I was the one who was wrong." It was a small thing, and it was everything, because it meant her name, down in the valley, would no longer be the name of a liar. It would be the name of the woman who had been right, the woman who had known. And whatever else the years took from her, they could not take that back now. He had said it aloud, in front of witnesses, and words like that do not unsay themselves. Ada Calloway, who had been turned out into the dark at midnight as a liar, had been believed at last. And outside, even as she let that settle into her chest, warm and quiet, the wind was rising again. Because the night was not finished with the mountain yet. It was Juno who heard it. Late, with the valley men asleep in a row around the fire, and Delamotte resting easy in the warm dark, and the bundles of green already set aside to carry down to the starving children at first light. The old dog rose, slow and stiff, and went to the door, and gave that low, uncertain whine she had given only once before. Ada took up the lamp and went out into the storm, and there, slumped in the snow not 20 steps from the wall, was a man who had climbed the whole mountain alone, in the dark, in the very teeth of the wind, long after the others. Boyd Sutter. He was nearly gone. His lips had gone the gray of the dying. His eyes were glassed and far away. His hands had frozen into useless claws against his chest. He had not come up the trail with the rest of them, sharing the rope and the work. He had come after, alone, driven up the mountain by some thing inside him that even he could not have named. And the mountain had very nearly finished him for it. Ada stood over him a long moment in the swirling snow, the lamp swinging in her hand, throwing wild shadows across the white. This was the man who had poisoned her name through the whole valley, who had spun the cruel lie about her dead husband and fed it, soft and patient, to every frightened soul who would listen, who had led the others up here to beat against her door with a club, who had screamed Samuel's name into the storm like a curse meant to kill. She could have left him there. The thought arrived, cold and clear and reasonable. No one would ever know. The storm keeps its own secrets. By spring, he would be only another shape under the melting snow, and the world would be no poorer for it, and arguably a little safer. For one long, frozen breath, the thought simply stood there, and she let it. And then Ada bent down, with her aching back and her stiff old knees, and she got her arms beneath him, and she dragged him in out of the cold. Because the storm does not remember who you are, but she would have to remember who she was, every single morning, for whatever years she had left. And she would not let herself become the kind of woman who left a man to freeze in the dark. Not even this man. Especially not this man. She got him in by the fire. The valley men woke and rose up on their elbows and watched in silence. Della watched from her blankets, her old eyes wide. And Roan Carver, who had come down off his high ridge that night to wait out the worst of the blow, watched from the shadows by the wall, saying nothing yet. Ada wrapped Boyd Sutter in the heated blankets, and she rubbed the frozen claws of his hands between her own, until the feeling came screaming back into them, and she forced the warm, bitter tea between his gray lips, a slow sip at a time. And little by little, painfully, the man who had tried so hard to destroy her came back from the very edge of the cold she had pulled him out of. When he could finally see again and finally shape words, the first thing Boyd Sutter did was look around the warm and living cave, at the green plants growing out of frozen stone, at the cured meat and the dry beds, and the sleeping men whose whole town his lies had helped to break, and at the old woman who had just dragged him out of his own grave, his face twisted, with shame, perhaps, or fury, or some terrible knot of both that he had no name for either. "Why?" he rasped, the words scraped out of his raw throat. Why pull me in after everything I did to you? You should have let me freeze out there. I'd have deserved it." Ada did not answer him. It was Roan Carver who stepped forward then, out of the shadows by the wall, into the full light of the fire. The old scout stood looking down at Boyd Sutter for a long, heavy moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice was quiet and weighted and certain in a way that filled the whole cave. "Because she's a better soul than the lie you've been hauling around your whole life," Roan said. "And it is long past time somebody set that lie down in front of you, son. I told her, weeks ago, that your husband saved men too proud to be saved. I didn't say the rest of it then. I'll say it now. I knew your father." Boyd went absolutely still. "I was there," Roan said. "That hard winter. The one you've spent every year since blaming on a dead man. I was at the high camps myself when the freight ran short, and folks got desperate." He drew a slow, deep breath, as if the words themselves were heavy to lift. "Samuel Calloway never stole so much as a crust of bread. Not one. What Samuel did was offer your father a place, offered to bring your whole family down to safe ground, offered to share what little he had put by against the cold. The same as he offered me. The same as he offered anybody who'd swallow their pride long enough to take it." The fire snapped loud in the dead silence. "Your father said no," Roan said, gentler now. "He was too proud to take what looked to him like charity. Too proud to be saved by a man who could read the weather better than he could. He swore he'd manage on his own." The old man paused. "And he didn't, Boyd. He didn't manage. The cold took him. The way it takes the proud and the careless, both." Roan's voice dropped low. "It was never theft that killed your father, son. It was pride. His own. And somewhere across the long years that followed, somebody found it a great deal easier to call it theft than to call it what it truly was. And you were just a boy then. You believed the story they handed you, the way a grieving boy always will." Boyd Sutter stared into the fire, and the thing that came apart in his face, slowly, was not rage at all. It was the slow, terrible collapse of a man watching the one solid load-bearing wall of his entire life turn before his eyes to sand and shadow. The grudge he had carried up this mountain through a storm that nearly killed him. The grudge he had built his whole self around, brick by bitter brick. The grudge that had let him stand in warm rooms and poison a kind valley against a harmless old woman and feel righteous doing it. A lie, all of it, every bit. A lie he had inherited as a child and tended into manhood and fed for so many long years that he had mistaken it completely for the truth, for himself, for the very shape of who he was. He made a sound, low and broken, deep in his chest, like something thawing that had been frozen solid for a very long time. He could not bring himself to look at Ada. "I can't," he whispered. "I can't undo any of it. The things I said about your husband. The things I made the whole valley believe about you. The night I came up here to break your door." "No," Ada agreed quietly. "You can't." She let that sit in the air between them. She did not rush to soften it. Some truths should not be softened, and a person does not heal from a lie by being lied to gently about it. And then she said the rest of it. But you can stop carrying it up mountains, she said. You can set it down, right here, tonight, by this fire. Her voice did not harden and did not break. And you can spend whatever years you've got left being the kind of man your father might have been proud of, instead of the kind of frightened thing he turned into at the end. The kind that would rather freeze than be helped. She held his streaming eyes across the fire. That's the only road back there has ever been, Boyd. For you, for me, for any of us who've done wrong and lived to see it. There's no undoing. There never was. There's only this, choosing different. From here on out, one cold morning at a time. Boyd Sutter bowed his head, and he wept, the way a man weeps when something he has clenched in his fist for a lifetime finally, at last, lets go. Ada did not gather him up the way she had gathered Delamotte in her arms. She was not his mother. There were limits to grace, even hers. And she had more than earned the right to her limits. But she stayed there beside him, by the fire, through the long hours of the night. And that, from her, after every single thing he had done, was its own quiet kind of mercy. The winter broke, in the end, the way that all winters finally do. The snows thinned. The wind lost its teeth. The roads opened one by one, and the valley came creeping back to itself, thinner and humbler and quieter than it had gone into the dark. But it did not forget. The Reverend kept his word, and the valley learned at last the truth of the woman in the black stone. Ada Calloway did not come down off the mountain. The valley would have taken her back, gladly now. They would have made room for her, made their apologies, made her into a kind of quiet legend, the widow who had known all along. They would have given her the warmest seat by the chapel stove for the rest of her days, and called her wise, and meant it. She did not want it. She had found something up in the black stone that the warm valley could never have given her. Not vindication. She had learned, somewhere in the long defended nights, that vindication is a thin and bitter food. It fills the mouth and leaves the belly empty. And she had stopped being hungry for it. What she had found was a place where she was simply allowed to see clearly, without being punished for the seeing. So she stayed, and the cave, across the slow turning of the years, became something far larger than a cave. People began to climb the ridge, not to beat against her door this time, to learn. Widows trying to keep their children alive through hard seasons. Folk from valleys farther off than her own who had heard, the way such things travel, that there was a woman in the black stone who knew how to read a winter before it ever arrived. And it was, more often than not, the women who came, the ones the world had overlooked, the ones who had buried husbands and been told their knowing went into the ground with the men, the ones who had been called foolish or hysterical or simply old. They climbed the ridge to Ada Calloway, and she did not turn a single one of them away. She taught them the way Roan had once taught her, by working beside them, never once in front of them. How to keep the bedding up off the damp ground, so the night could not steal the warmth from a sleeping child. How to stack the wood so the snow could not rot the lower rows. How to read the smoke and the pressure and the simple, honest wisdom of where an old dog chooses to lie down. How to notice the winter coming, long before the winter announced itself to fools. Della Motte came to live on the ridge in the end. The two old women who had spent so many frozen years turned away from one another, spent their last ones side by the same fire. Della tended the sick who climbed the trail, her mother's old healing knowledge welcome again at long last, finally enough, finally honored. And in the long evenings the two of them sat together and said very little, the way that people do when all the saying that needed doing is long behind them. And the boy, Toby Hale, grew up. The thin child with the limp he tried to hide and the watchful eyes that saw everything became a steady young man with careful hands and a careful heart. Ada gave him the notebook in time. Samuel's old notebook, gone soft as cloth. Its pages filled now with her own writing layered patiently over the dead man's. And Toby took up the work as if he had been born to it. Every autumn he walked the valley roads, recording the frost depth and the creek ice, and the way the elk came down too early off the high country. The boy who had once crossed a killing trail through the snow just to say, "I still believe you," became, in the fullness of time, the one the whole valley believed. And every winter, thin smoke still rose from the black stone ridge, steady and clean and unafraid, a small gray line drawn against all that white. Toward the very end, when her own hands had gone stiff and her own eyes had grown dim, Ada would sit by the fire in the evenings with old Juno asleep at her feet. The dog's muzzle had long since gone as white as the snow outside the door. Most nights, neither of them moved much at all. They had both of them earned their stillness, and they took it gladly. Ada never once spoke of the valley as a place that had wronged her. She had set that down too, somewhere along the road, the very same as she had asked Boyd Sutter to set down his. It was too heavy a thing to carry all the way to the end, and she wanted her hands free, at the last, for warmer things to hold. She thought instead, on those quiet snowbound nights, about the strange and unexpected shape a single life can take. How a woman could be cast out into the freezing dark as a liar and walk, without knowing it, straight into the truest and warmest room she would ever know. How the very cold that had nearly killed her had, in the end, handed her everything that mattered. A purpose, a daughter she had chosen late, and a son she had chosen later still, an old and faithful dog, a steady fire, a reason to wake in the morning. The wind still came down hard off the mountains every winter. The storms still buried the roads. The cold still took the careless and the proud, the same as it always had, with no malice in it and no mercy either. Only its old, indifferent, unchanging honesty. The mountain had never once apologized for being exactly what it was, and Ada Calloway, somewhere in those long years, had finally stopped needing it to. She had come to understand the one thing the whole valley had spent a lifetime refusing to learn, that the weather had never been cruelty. It was only ever a language, and the ones who learn, against all cost, to listen to it, and the ones the world casts out for listening to it too well, are so very often the same people. One evening, Late, with the fire burning low and gold, and the snow falling soft and steady and silent past the door, Ada rested her stiff old hand on the warm gray head of the dog asleep at her feet. Outside, the wind moved through the high timber like distant water. Inside, it was quiet and dry and warm, and the green things beneath the black stone, beside the patient running water, went on growing in the dark, the way they always had, the way they always would, long after, believed at the last, and no longer, ever again, alone.